everyone. I am honored to have you join us. I'm Michelle Vitas, founder and CEO of Slate Advisors. We are a tech-enabled leadership and career transition coaching firm that partners with companies ranging from growth stage startups to the Fortune 1000. And I've been personally laid off. In fact, it was out of a layoff experience a number of years back that I founded Slate. And while layoffs can feel like an uncomfortable topic, navigating them well is really important. And how you treat people who are being let go sends a very powerful message to those who remain. A lot of companies are facing potential layoffs right now. If you are among them, you are not alone. Over the past 3 weeks, 1 in 10 working age adults filed for unemployment. And a recent survey indicated that 49% of US companies were at least somewhat likely to conduct layoffs in the next 3 months. Making this even more challenging, many of our team members are currently working from home. To weigh in on this and answer your questions, we have an outstanding panel here today. Steve Cadigan is a board member, talent advisor, and former head of talent at LinkedIn. He was on the task force at Cisco that led the reduction of 8,000 global staff in 2002. He was at the helm of Cisco Asia when SARS broke out in 2003, and he's a highly respected HR executive with deep experience in organizational change. Beth Steinberg is the Vice President of People and Talent at Chime and a startup advisor. Through layoffs at multiple companies, she's seen firsthand the power of focusing on your people, those who are let go, those who remain, and the leaders who guide your company through the process. Matthew Temple is a career and professional development expert at the Kellogg School of Management. He's been on both sides of the tables during layoffs, regularly coaches people who've been laid off, and strives to see those who are laid off leave with as much dignity as possible. Today, we'll be discussing what's unique about navigating layoffs in the current environment, adapting your plan for layoff notifications, equipping your managers, and casting a future vision. More than anything though, we are here for you, and I want to invite you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask us questions throughout the discussion. We're also going to leave some time at the end for additional questions. So Beth, to start, would love to hear from you. What do you see as unique about navigating layoffs in this current environment?
Yeah, well, thank you, Michelle. I think, it's a difficult environment with so many layoffs happening in an economic climate that is, arduous at best. I feel really grateful I'm at a company that is not doing any layoffs and we're continuing to hire. But I'm ultra sensitive to what it's like in companies right now because I've been there. And I think for me, the most important thing to remember is you need to look at this through the lens of the people. If you are not sensitive to how you are treating people who you're letting go and how you're communicating and treating the people that remain, it's going to be really difficult to achieve your business objectives long term. You really need to get people to understand why these changes have happened, be honest, transparent, and treat everybody with respect and dignity in order to remain a solid company moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Steve, anything to add there about what makes this time unique for navigating layoffs? Steve, you're on mute.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, so listen, if you're at the point where you have exhausted every possible alternative to get to the point where you're having to let people go, I think the first thing that I would encourage you to do is recognize how harsh the reality is that Beth talked about, which is we're letting people go in the most bleak, grim economic environment of all of our lifetimes. The opportunity to get another job is dismal right now. And so that added layer of emotion, added layer of anxiety, I think should govern you to want to prepare more and really, really think through how to land that message. And I don't know that you're going to do it in a way that's going to make anyone happy, but there are definitely worse degrees of how poorly you could do it. So I would want to be very mindful of the environment that I'm addressing my affected staff with, and be very extra cautious and sensitive to how hard it's going to be, even to the point where, you know, you're having to do this in a way that we've probably is suboptimal. And that leads me to the other thing, which is recognize in when you're having these communications with the people that this is not the way you wanted this to play. This is not the kind of environment you would rather meet with someone, you know, face to face in person, but it's just not possible right now for obvious reasons.
Yeah. And when we were talking earlier, the topic of not knowing how long this is going to last also came up. So what makes navigating layoffs in this uncertain environment maybe a little different as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is where planning for how deep to cut becomes almost impossible. Like, how long can you sustain when you don't even know, you know, how long some of the restrictions are going to be in place, the disability for people to meet, and the social distance requirements. It is really, really hard. And, you know, it gets to something which I've spent most of my career thinking about, which is, you know, from a context point of view, how to look at this is really, I think, try to focus on trust and, you know, how you run your process, how you run your communications. Is that resulting in building greater trust, not just for the people you're communicating to that have to leave, but to the people who are staying with you, you know, and be very, very.
I'd like to talk more about that, because the communications are even trickier in a remote environment. And we've seen several companies deliver layoff messages via large group video calls and face some criticism around things like leaving participant videos on, or disabling chat, or having confusion when people join late. So we're seeing that remote communication is a challenging one. Can you speak to that, and how might companies do it better?
Yeah, so I guess, you know, my preference in the best of times would be that you have an environment where you're controlling everything. You have a company meeting, it's all live, and then you set up one-on-one meetings with the affected people. You can't do that now. And I think my bias would be that I would sacrifice the need to let everyone know at once. So in normal times, you want to try to avoid rumors growing, okay? And I think, you know, those of us who've been in this business for a while, most companies or most employees are expecting something bad is probably going to happen right now. So managing the rumor flow is over. So I wouldn't build a process that is trying to manage the communication tightly. I would build a process that allows me to try to deliver a more intimate message to a smaller group than an impersonal one to a larger audience. And so I think we just, and this, again, this is just my personal preference, I would try to default to a more personal, individual, authentic delivery to a smaller group, and maybe, and even a staggered time frame. And say that would be my approach versus one huge one where the opportunity for what I call an unforgivable moment is really, really high, you know?
Yeah. And can you speak a little bit more to that unforgivable moment? What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Well, I feel like in times of extra emotion, as we're experiencing right now, where people's anxiety levels are really high and we don't have visibility to the future. I mean, human nature is I want to know if I'm safe, and we don't know so many elements of that right now. So I think we're measuring leaders' decisions and actions and communications with more scrutiny. And so I think that's the backdrop that I call, like, you know, we're seeing now a slow stream of these communications of reductions that are not going well. And I would not want my company to be on that list. And so and again, maybe it was someone had a bad day, you know, on a Navy ship, or maybe there's, you know, things behind it, but no one's being very forgiving right now. And the thing to remember, and we talked about this in our huddle before the conference here, is people who leave are, and the access of your recovery plan, people are going to know how you did this. And people are going to see that maybe you didn't get your CEO or leadership team in front of the company. You had some unknown person deliver some awkward message. That's not going to play well for you. And so I would, and the problem is for all of us delivering it is, I get it. You're worried about the people you're letting go and how they're going to react. Don't over-index on that. Be mindful of, this is our future. This is a cultural moment that people are going to really measure you by. So that's what I mean.
Great. Matthew, you had some additional thoughts in regard to actually that one-on-one conversation that people are having, and the risk of catching people at a place for that call when they're not prepared to take it. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And one thing I'd want to echo, which Steve just said, is, remember, we're also living in an era right now where that unforgivable moment may be captured on video because you're doing it remotely and they hit the record button on Zoom, or it's going to be reposted online. And we should enter that conversation regardless of that. You want to do your best and do a good job, whether that's going to happen or not. But there is that added layer out there. But we should try to approach it as best we can. And when we think about, then what are the ways that we have to navigate this more carefully in a virtual world? One thing to recognize is many people are working from home, and their home environment has changed. Their kids who are at college are back home now. Their partners are back home. They might have roommates nearby. So they are not necessarily working in a private room or area. And so you may want to say to them at the beginning, can you move into an area where we can have a private conversation so they can see that coming? How do you preserve their dignity? You also probably want to check in and make sure they're ready. You may want to start by saying, I need to deliver some challenging news, and I want to make sure you're in a place where we can talk privately again. You may want to give them the option of turning off their video, and just so they can expect that. And then finally, how do we get to the point quickly and not ramble? They know something difficult is going to be coming, so cut to the chase.
Yeah. Beth, anything to add in terms of the navigation?
Yeah, I think, Steve alluded a little bit to this, but since it is such an unprecedented time in the economy, I think practically speaking, when you're thinking about what you can offer employees that are going to be exiting your company, you need to think very broadly about that. So little things are going to matter a lot to people right now. Having an extra month of insurance is going to really matter to people and their families. Extending the exercise date post-termination is going to really matter to people. They may have given years to a company and have had, options vested that they will not be they won't be able to afford to exercise those. And I think little things that you can augment to what you may normally do in a situation of termination is going to mean a lot to employees, and it's going to speak a lot to the people who are remaining at the company, that you took extra steps to take care of the people who were no longer going to be at the company.
Right, and some of those things don't cost you anything.
That's
So
right.
for example, at LinkedIn, if you're going to let someone go, why don't you let them keep their professional access for a period of time? If it's a DoorDash delivery person, give them free delivery for the remainder of X amount of period. There's so many things. Beth makes a really great point, that are in your control. That's and right. Try to remove that fear factor. Oh my gosh, we're going to have lawsuits. It's going to, and think about how would you want it delivered to you, as Matthew was saying, and we already know it's suboptimal, but even recognizing that, what little things can you do to soften the burdens that people are going to have? Maybe it's keep the laptop. Maybe it's keep paying for their cell phone bills, right?
Yeah. And some companies have done that. And even though a furlough might be different than a layoff in many respects, Macy's has sort of stepped up and they're paying even the employees' contribution for their health care through the end of May as a way to help them. And that builds goodwill. And, for some of those people that are furloughed, they're going to try to bring back as many of them as possible. So how do you start to plan for the future as you're doing those things now?
Yeah, and that is in line with a question that came up in the chat box. It says, Steve, building on something you said, can you elaborate on having to fish from the very same streams you are releasing into through this reduction in force, what it does to your employment brand?
Right. John Chambers, as Beth knows, because she and I were colleagues there, has a very famous expression where he would say, in the darkest of times is when you really find out the mettle you have as a leader and as an organization. And now is really a great time for you to recognize that everything you're doing is going to be under a microscope. Future candidates, your departing employees are your brand ambassadors. And how well or how poorly you do that is going to have long-lasting consequences. And you may think we got to throw the jewelry overboard and you've gone blank. You're going to have to slap yourself out of that and realize that everything you're doing is going to be seen longer term. And it's in these times where you really find out what you're made of. And I worry about a lot of these unicorns, if you will, that grew really fast, didn't really define what their leadership dimensions were, and are really caught with their pants down. You're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So yeah, I think it's a great question that came up, and your brand, your employer brand, is on the line right now.
It is. I mean, I think obviously we're going to overcome this. It's going to take some time, but when people start getting, when you start getting a robust economy again and people are looking at jobs, your company, whether you are laying people off right now or if you are not, it is going to be really looked at as how you treated employees during this difficult time period. That is going to be your employment brand. And you need to be really sensitive to that, and you need to do the right thing for people. And I think that is going to really define leadership in the next few years.
And are there any nuances, given the culture of a company, of how they might actually conduct notifications in this challenging time? Any cultural nuances, company cultural nuances that come to mind?
I think, what's interesting is I feel like we're almost at a point where we're going to have to build some new ones, right? How we communicate, how we organize, how we make decisions is a little bit different right now. And so it's interesting. Yeah, every company is having their culture of transparency, if you will, tested. Their culture of, inclusiveness or authenticity. Hold that close, because now's when people are going to see, are you going to walk the talk? But also forgive yourself a little bit that no one saw this coming, and it's really some impossible decisions that we have to make and looking into the future. What's super hard is the crystal ball is completely dark, and I'm stealing from some of the medical experts that I'm watching, probably too much on some of the news channels, around like, hey, until we really can test, we really don't know much about how long or how deep or how challenging this is going to be. And so, give yourself a little bit of a break as a leadership team around, okay, we don't know, but as much as you can, and I would try to tell this to my organization, we don't want to have to keep doing this month after month. So we're trying to take a measured reduction in cost cutting as much as we can. But, I'd like to sort of throw this back to Matthew and Beth, because one of the things that we've noticed, and I've noticed this in other reductions that I've done, is sometimes it's the frontline staff that mostly gets reduced and not the senior levels. And I don't, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about that, and I don't, of all the big layoffs that's happened, I honestly don't have a great perspective if it has been across the board or if it has been just, individual contributors. But I do think that's a signal to the company. If you're in a company that's doing layoffs of, first level leaders and individual contributors, yet the entire executive team is intact, not taking any sort of truncation of pay or not making any sacrifice themselves, that's a signal to your people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you need to be very clear-eyed about how that is going to impact your culture and your trust moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some companies have done a good job of trying to communicate that out. So I think in Yelp, for example, some of the senior leaders took a 20 to 30% pay cut. And I think the CEO said he was going to give up, his salary for this year. That sends a strong signal. Steve, you had talked about transparency and just understanding, like, we're taking this on as well. Obviously, they're not going to be affected in the same way that maybe some hourly workers and some of the other people, but we've got to be in this together. And I think that's one of the ways that you rebuild trust after something like this happens.
Yeah, and I think another reference to Yelp, and this is, I don't have any firsthand knowledge, this is just what I've publicly read. They did try to figure out what else they could do to avoid this. They didn't go to layoffs as the first thing you would do, which it shouldn't be. It should be the last thing you should do. And I think, articulating that to the company of, here's all the things that we're doing to look at expenses and to change the way that we're going to work. As we did the calculation, we still had to do layoffs. But I think being able to articulate the steps that you took as a business to make this the last resort instead of the first resort is really critical long-term.
Mm-hmm.
One other cultural nuance, and I'm just doing these Zooms so frequently now. It's like a reminder of, don't go to the face, Steve. Don't. So I'm trying to keep my hands down. But one of the things that, again, talking about unforgivable moments and the increased anxiety is, I think employees are expecting and hoping and will benefit from you using your assets to help the community somehow, some way, above and beyond the normal course of business. So, whether it is you're in a background check company and you're going to go, there's one firm that I'm working with up in Canada called Certain, and they're giving free background checks to any medical provider out there in the world right now. Well, that is culturally going to build some love from your employees, their families, and they're seeing that you're going above and beyond. Mm-hmm. And, there's some big ones like Amazon out there. And I'm just like, what are you guys doing? You're in every community. You have a chance to make a difference. It would be nice and a huge gesture. So, I put that challenge out there from a culture perspective. We're worried about staff reductions, but you have so many assets in your control that could benefit. And that will help, I think, ease some of the strain and make people proud.
And I've seen some small companies do a great job like that. There was, I was meeting with an alum a month ago in Miami, and they were opening up a restaurant in the historically Black neighborhood of Overton, Miami. And obviously the restaurant opening was delayed. They gave, they put together food for the community and gave it out. And I think that was just a great way to build goodwill in, when you weren't going to have your opening for a while.
Yeah, great. We've got a couple of questions coming in. First one is, employees who remain may ask, do we have more layoffs coming? How should we respond to this?
I think Steve alluded to it a little bit in the beginning. I think, in terms of layoffs, the adage has always been measure twice and cut once. It may not be possible right now because there is so much uncertainty. And, I think it's important to be open and transparent, but also to know as a leader that your team has put together a solid go forward plan to demonstrate to the company that you're doing everything possible to avoid any second round of layoffs, and to be able to show that plan. And obviously grieving needs to take place around the loss of people leaving the company. And I think we're also grieving, a global pandemic. So I think the grief is real for people and the sadness is real. But as soon as it is possible to get your team on board of what that go forward vision is, and how you're going to avoid as best you can doing this again is really critical to try to communicate to the company.
The one other thing I might do to sort of set the table is also just say, look, we're living in a very VUCA world right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we're going to try to be as transparent with you as we have information. But, here's where we are right now, and this is how we're going forward.
Yeah.
Right. And I would love to tell you that we can't do any other reductions or there won't be any other in the future, but until the future becomes clear, we don't know. And by the way, we're doing everything we can for the people that we let go. We're supporting them. And, and I would encourage organizations to help people, the ones that you let go. This is a global community right now. And so I think, those are great answers from Beth and Matthew, and just acknowledge the uncertainty, and not from the standpoint of you can't promise it, but from the standpoint of just, hey, it is really, really ridiculously impossible to know everything right now, but we're doing everything we can to take hard decisions. That's why what we were talking about earlier would be so important is everyone's going to see who's let go. And if it's just frontline workers and not some leadership positions, you're going to have harder questions to answer that aren't going to feel good, And so think about that.
On the transparency front question, when you are sharing transparently about all the things you did before layoffs, is that sharing just with the Go Forward team, or do you share that with the affected team too?
Yeah, I guess my knee jerk is you could go either way on that one. Probably the impacted team wants to know that there was a lot done, but they really want to know what does it mean for me? And I would want to answer that first. If they want to ask me questions, I'll probably tell them, but I could go both ways on that. What do you think, Beth?
I mean, I think as much, if I was delivering that message to someone right now, I would want them to understand that sincerely, we tried to look at every single thing that we could do before we did this. So I may not share, complete detail, but I would definitely want to share, this is the exercise that we did. Here's what we came up with. So people understand that this was an analytical and planned process and not an ad hoc process.
And I would probably share it fairly openly, knowing it's going to come out anyways. When you're looking at how stuff is being released, do you really want it in a trickle, or do you want to get it out there? So I may not go into, all of the detail, but I'm going to assume that almost anything I'm sharing is going to come out eventually. So I would probably err to the side of being more open, more transparent.
Yeah, and when you're reading about these layoffs, I mean, you're reading about companies where there's a lot of confusion from employees of companies that perhaps just did, multi-$100 million raises, and employees are confused. If you just closed a, $400 million round 2 months ago, why you're now laying off 100 people. So maybe it's because that business unit isn't going to move forward or something, but something is definitely getting lost in translation in terms of how it's hitting employees and their understanding of what was done before this action was taken.
Question coming in back to order of operations. Is there an order of operations you recommend? One-on-ones, then all hands with affected and Go Forward team, then all hands with just Go Forward, or all hands with everyone? What do you suggest on that front?
I guess the first question I would have is depends on how big and how capable your leaders are communicating. So what assets do I have? Do I have trust that my leaders can land this well? And are they prepared? My preference is always let the impacted people know first, and then have all hands with the folks who are still with you to cover that. And just respect the privacy, give people the opportunity in one-on-one to have their emotional reaction and not have to have that be in a group setting. That's just my bias. I've seen it done in lots of different ways, but that would probably be my preference.
Beth, anything?
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I do agree with Steve that a lot of it is based on size of the company. I mean, in some companies, it's not going to be, you're not going to have the ability to do a one-on-one with 1,000 people within a day, and so I think you need to balance, being pragmatic and being human. and figure out a way where you were going to try to get a clear, consistent, and empathetic message to people in as short of time as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to be able to stage it like you normally would. You're just not.
No, and that's what I was going to say. I think what's just really unprecedented about this is the scale. You know, it's 1,000 people at a time, or, you know, Macy's, it was having to furlough 130,000 people. And you're having, and Steve, you had made this comment earlier, you're having managers who've never been through a downturn like this, having to deliver that message. If they've been in the workforce 10 years, they haven't really experienced this downturn. And so how do you quickly talk them through, and how do you train them, and how do you kind of give them best practices for doing that? And there may not always be that time to do it. And so I think that's what's been such a struggle for so many companies right now.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that gets back to, you know, there are many different ways that you could do it based on how large the number of impacted people are, but default to, you know, think about your brand, think about how this is going to be received. How would you want it received? If you have people who have been laid off, please get them on the leadership team, get them to share with everyone else how that felt, and then try to architect the best possible approach that you can. No one's going to blame you for not doing it perfectly if you really tried hard to get it right, and explain to them why you did what you did, right?
Yeah, and I think also just being honest, like this is new for everybody. There is no playbook for laying people off in a global pandemic, you know, and having some vulnerability yourself, as well as obviously you're trying to, you know, deliver a clear message, but, you know, people know if you're hurting too when you're giving this and giving those messages. And I think, you know, if it is not hard for you, you probably shouldn't be in a leadership role.
There's a question: if the layoff is driven by a financial situation and you can't offer any severance, how will you deliver that message, clarify and justify?
Yeah, it's just, if you don't have it, you don't have it. You know, what I would try to do is find some other way to buy time. And whether that's, we're going to keep you on the payroll at 50% for 3 weeks, or something to soften that. But it's not in a lot of states, it's not statutorily required. But I think there's an expectation that people will want that. So here's what I would say. If you're in that situation, I would get my lawyer, my legal team to understand everything about unemployment, everything about what the government, funding has provided, and make that pathway easy. You know, remember, my family is not able to work because of this. And so we went to try to navigate filing an unemployment claim. Good luck with that. Okay. Like hours trying to figure out, and talking to people and trying to get not easy. If you can help people navigate getting access to relief somehow, I think that will help build you some goodwill.
I have another comment coming in from another participant. One thing I've seen make a big difference for those leaving and those remaining is making efforts to appreciate the contributions and personalized farewells within the team. You know, something that doesn't cost money, showing appreciation for someone's service makes everyone feel better about the organization if they feel their years of contribution are valued and remembered versus an abrupt cutoff.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's, obviously during this time, but anytime. I mean, I have a lot of sensitivity around, when people quit on their own or when they're, terminated during normal time, and, all of a sudden they're not good at their job anymore. And well, they were good enough to be hired and you loved them then. And so, I think, again, it says so much about you as a human and you as a company in how you talk about people when they are leaving. And so I think that's a great idea. If you're able to celebrate the contributions of your colleagues and memorialize that some way, I think that's an amazing gesture you could make.
Yeah, it's interesting. I prior to this pandemic, I was ready to publish a book on the future of work, and now I have to completely rethink this, what it means. And one of the observations I've had, which we haven't talked about, but I think it's a reality for most mid to large organizations, is this huge contingent workforce that is usually just completely removed in a situation like this. And they don't have the conversation that we're talking about with leadership. Company calls the agency and says, hey, we're going to have to end these contracts. And that's a huge growing number of people that, are sort of having to land in awkwardly. I really believe in getting to the conversation around communicating with people, remembering they're still in your orbit and they're still, if you're a B2C, they're still a potential customer, is just not looking at the world of you work for me, you don't work for me, but just an ecosystem. Because I want people wanting to come back as soon as the switch gets turned, and we're able to, or we slowly turn it back on. I want those people wanting to come back work for me because we treated them as well as we could have done, whether they're a contractor, whether they were a full-time employee,
Yep, absolutely. And turning to the managers who are actually delivering a lot of these notification messages, there can be a lot of fear of delivering that message. And I remember the first time I was tasked with laying someone off, and I wanted to show compassion, and yet I feared I was going to say the wrong thing, either legally or just on a human level. Can you speak to that? Matthew, how can we equip managers to handle notifications in the best possible way?
I think some of the challenge right now, which we said earlier, is, look, some of these managers have never been through a downturn like this. The economy's kind of just gone up the last 10 years. So I think one is, how do we just train them in the best practices of delivering that message? Prepare them to just be frank and get to the point as quickly as possible. Don't draw it out. I think as well, you want to avoid, and it's tough because we're human, but you want to avoid saying how hard it is for you. It's a lot harder for them. And then finally, even as a manager going through and laying someone off, it is a hard thing to go through. Yeah. And so then how do you recharge? How do you decompress after that? And the pandemic has even made that difficult, because normally you might say, well, I'm going to go to the gym. Well, the gym's closed. I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to see friends. Well, you can't get together with people. So, at the very least, don't schedule something after you have to do something like that. It's a tough thing to go through. And so you might be going out for a walk, socially distanced, but schedule in some time to recharge and collect your thoughts after something like that.
Great. And a follow-on question that's related to that. We know that this is especially hard for those being let go, but those doing the letting go are surely going to experience emotional trauma as well. How do you support your team and yourself during this time?
Yeah, I think
Matthew, you touched on that.
Steve, I think that's where you do want to get that team together afterwards, and you do need to start talking about the future. And I think it's going to be okay to show your vulnerability. It's going to be difficult for everyone. I think that's one of the things that can bring that team together, bring those managers together afterwards, is show that vulnerability, be transparent.
Yeah, and if I remember a time I had to let someone go, and I'd been coaching people to let other folks go and never done it myself. And I had to bring in some help, bring in someone to help me do it, because I was really worried about my emotions. And it's a good thing that I did, because I got about halfway through the first sentence and I just kind of started getting my throat in a knot. So if you really sense someone needs extra help, or you are that person that needs it yourself, get someone that you trust that's not going to be overly awkward for the person on the other end, right? Whether it's someone that they know that, is in the circle of trust, if you will, or someone in the human resources team that has experience and can help take the baton if you sort of lose it, because it is really, really hard.
It is. And I think you've got to, I don't want people to seem like they're reading from a script or overly rehearsed, but I do think if you've never done it before, to role play with someone can be really helpful, because it's hard to gauge someone's reactions. You'll probably get some people who will be very angry, and some people who will be, very, may cry. I mean, you'll get a lot of different reactions, and you as a leader are going to have to absorb that and help get them through to the end of the conversation. Like Matthew said, you really shouldn't belabor it. You need to sort of get to the message quickly and then be very human afterwards. But you may need to role play that with somebody if you've never done it before.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about who should be delivering the message. We don't have enough HR to support the number of one-on-one conversations. Is it okay to have managers handle the bulk of the conversations and then have HR on hand for any additional conversations?
Sounds like that's a prospective client for you, Michelle. Michelle, and she's very, understated around what Slate can do, but this is a quick commercial message that she built her company because of a negative, sour experience of getting laid off. That's where it all started. And it's pivoted based on customer needs over the years to executive coaching. But career coaching is right in the wheelhouse. And there are firms out there that can help you do this. And if you can't, if you can't afford, I wouldn't want an external person letting my people go. No. But I would want someone to help coach and really help practice, as Beth said, and script this so that you're as prepared as you possibly can be. That's okay. Most organizations, they don't have anyone with HR, or you have someone who's the de facto cultural, role model, and someone who's got a degree of leadership in the company that may be best equipped to do it. Right.
And I think it's fine to have the managers do it without someone from the people team there, as long as obviously they're equipped to it. But I would want to make sure that it wasn't, that they were able to give some of the key messages around like what separation looks like and benefits looks like, because what you don't want is someone to have to wait then to have a subsequent conversation and be in terrible anxiety, not understanding what their potential exit package is going to look like. So I think the timing needs to be exceedingly tight if that's the way you're going to do it.
And that's where some of the senior leaders and senior managers have to step in. I mean, they're all in this together. You can't just outsource that. You can't do it by proxy. That's where they're going to have to step up and do it.
Yeah. And I remember my very first startup, we overhired and we subsequently had to lay off about half the company. It was the first time I owned the whole function myself. I had previously been at larger companies, and the CEO did not come to work that day. And I had to have, myself and the CFO had to have conversations with 150 people. And it was a pivotal point in my career where I truly understood that, if a leader is not ready to be in there with you, the leader should not be the leader. And so you do need all the leaders in the company to step up, no matter how difficult this is. This is where true leadership is going to show up or not show up.
Mm-hmm. So we spoke to the manager's role in delivering the notification message. A question came in around what examples have you seen of folks helping their laid off employees with recruiting efforts? Are there tools or best practices that you recommend?
Yeah, so I've seen a ton, and they're out there right now. So if you're looking for it, you won't have to look too far. The Chronicle in San Francisco has got an ongoing list of who's hiring. Search firms are doing that. What you want to do is call, if you're a manager and people letting go, call all your network and let them know what's happening now is people are cutting into bone and A players are getting released, which is really hard. So there's really good talent out there. So, building some of those lists, doing networking for them. There's and then, if there's a team of people that is really well networked, get those people out there circulating, doing that, get a hold of, temporary agencies, whatever, because there might be some short-term work instead of long-term work that's available. So try to, really network. And then it comes to, help people with their LinkedIn profile, help them, brush up their networking skills, all these other things. And maybe you don't do it yourself, but you say, hey, here are the top classes on whatever fill in the blank, online learning platform around building a platform, building your interview skills, activating your network after a downturn, all these things. So they're like, boom, you're leading them. And they're maybe not ready for that yet because they're in the sort of anger, denial, rejection. But when they get to the point of acceptance, that you made it easy for them to get there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say I've been very heartened by how, at least in the networks I'm in both coasts, have really come together to try to share who's hiring,
Mhm.
lists of impacted employees, and really trying to work together to try to see if we can help people within the people and talent community.
Yeah.
We deliver a lot of webinars and content to our 60,000 alumni at Kellogg. Those are free and open, and we've made many of those available to the public at large. So whether it's how do you maximize your LinkedIn profile, how do you create a powerful resume, how do you interview virtually, how do you lead through uncertainty. So we've opened up a lot of that just to help people in a time like this.
Awesome. And then there is career transition services, which is what our firm does, which gives you that one-on-one support. So resume and LinkedIn profile support, as well as a career advisor to help you position yourself in your search and then execute a more strategic search. To Steve's point, we do see people tapping into skill development platforms, things like Udemy. We use a platform to help people prep for coding interviews for software engineers. So there's tools out there that can be supplemental and can help people expedite their search. Any thoughts on reskilling, moving talent around? Also, any chance you could share some of these resources for positioning yourself in the search? I'm glad to send, on the sharing some of the resources, I'm glad to send a follow-up email, and I can include the link to what Matthew described as well. Anyone else want to comment on the reskilling and moving talent around?
I guess I would just say that this is a hard time to take on reskilling if you're not really sure how the world's going to look afterwards. But what every company is realizing right now is where they're exposed on their technology platform.
Yeah.
And so around managing remote teams and working from a distance. So to the extent that you've identified some things and you have people that you can help, point in the right direction, I would do that. I really believe the company of the future is one that's constantly doing this. You have to do that. People are only going to stay with you if you're invested in making them better for an uncertain future. And that came a lot faster than I was anticipating, but here we are. And as an employer, I would start giving this, it's a great question. I would start giving this a lot of thought because we're going to have to be a reskilling engine as any organization for the future, because most companies don't have a 10-year plan now. Maybe they have a 5-year plan. And this is going to make people realize that our ability to react is more important than our ability to plan, because we can't plan in an uncertain world. So, yeah.
And I've been telling people in the short term, just, think through what are some gaps you want to close, what are some skills you want to get, and how can you do that in a less expensive way. So some of the free online platforms, whether it's Coursera, edX, Udemy, but use that time now to just learn those new skills. And the other thing that I've really been pushing people to do, get really good at interviewing virtually. There's so much of this is going to be done virtually. So whether it's making sure there's frontal lighting, proper placement, a good background, getting very comfortable, that's going to be a big part of people's search. That is time very well spent right now.
And I also think we often, and women do this a lot, we often underestimate what we've accomplished in roles and what skills we've learned. And so I think it's a great conversation to have with a trusted person of, are you really able to articulate all of the things that you've accomplished, all of the skills that you've built? Because I think sometimes we're so in the day-to-day, we are not really seeing how much we've done. And I think it's going to be really important to be able to articulate it.
Yep. Awesome. And so we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to the casting the vision piece of this all. So Steve, post-layoff, how should leaders cast the vision for the future and engage their retained employees?
So I want to encourage all of you that are facing this unenviable task of having to let people go to try to get yourself to a place where you look at this from a opportunity to play offense than just an opportunity to be defensive, and say, you know what, we're going to model to the world and to this team and to our prospective employees that we are all about, leading from the front, about being authentic and real and genuine and standing behind what we're doing and helping the people that we're letting go. So I think, you have a great opportunity in really dark times to build that trust that we talked about earlier. And so in casting that, planting the real strong flag that this is a culture that really is going to be one that we'll get through this somehow. And we're going to build trust, even with the people that we're letting go, that we're treating with dignity and respect. That's how I would want to frame the vision of how to go through this exercise is, yes, we haven't been through it in a few decades. We haven't seen something like this before. Yes, we have a whole generation of leaders that are probably scared to death around what's happening right now. And if it's not just the communication, it's, are they next on the chopping block? So, how I would say, you can't make promises about the future. None of us can right now, but try to take an offensive mindset to say, let me use this and to really show our true mettle, right?
Matthew, anything to add in terms of the practicalities of that, of what it looks like to build trust with your remaining team members?
I think a couple of things. I think one, it starts with communications. And I think, how do you communicate more frequently in particular? So I'm probably communicating 2 to 4 times more frequently with the teams I lead. My monthly meetings have become weekly meetings. My weekly meetings have become twice a week meetings. And so those check-ins are important. It's also become much more personal. In our first meeting after the world had changed, I had my whole team on Zoom, and we're used to working virtually. But, I asked 4 questions. I started with, how are you doing? How is your family and your friends doing? What's been most challenging? What's been one good thing that's happened? And it was really important to connect on that. And one of my coaches started talking about clients, and I said, I don't want to hear about them. We're going to get to them later, but this is about you. And probably a third of our meeting focused on that, but that's been really important to build that out. I think the second thing is really deepening some of those relationships with the people you work with. One of the fun things I do at Kellogg is I serve as a faculty advisor for one of our international classes. We meet winter quarter, and the students a little bit, and then you really get to know them that first day you're traveling with them. You get to kind of understand their eating habits, their sleeping habits, even their bathroom habits. And it's interesting. It's been very similar when you're on Zoom with your team. You're talking to people on Zoom and their kids hop into the background, and it's very humanizing. And you hope their kids don't say that funny nickname you have for your fellow colleague. And you see what people are, their at-home leisure wear, and you see their grooming habits going awry. And you see their funny backgrounds, and it humanizes us and it connects us in a really great way. And so I think one of the takeaways is we are connecting with our team on a more personal level. And I think that's going to really help us as we cast that vision for the future.
Great. We've got time for a couple more questions. One coming in, we've done our best to deliver furlough and layoff messages with kindness and empathy, but we worry that impacted employees might still be inclined to make their frustrations public via LinkedIn, going to the press, etc. How would you recommend the company responds if this happens?
The way I refer to this is, it's inevitable that you're going to have a sniper shot come your way. It's just inevitable, even under the best of circumstances and following the best practices. So the only way that drowns out is if you have more great feedback from other people that just makes that disappear, because it doesn't stand out more. If no one's saying good things about you on all these platforms, whether it's Glassdoor or LinkedIn or whatever, what have you, then that's going to stick out. But hopefully you build up some brand equity so that this will disappear. And I wouldn't try to close that down. This is where I see on some of the sites around companies, like immediately closing system access to people. People can still get word out, and the cell phone makes your employee a public relations department. The best way to mitigate that, again, is to have more good data about you out there in the world that makes this sort of seem insignificant, but also have a good process that, you run with integrity, right?
Yeah.
And I agree. I think it's going to be real bad form to immediately respond in a defensive way as a company around some of these messages, because, some of it may be real, some of it maybe not, but I think the emotion is truly real. And it's not going to be a good look, I think, to appear defensive.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I think
yeah. Go ahead,
I was going to say, I think Yelp did a good job of sort of saying, look, these are all the things that we've thought through before we arrived at this decision. Here's how we, senior management took a cut in pay. We've done this. We really looked at extending benefits. I think the more that you can just be transparent about that, the better. And then you don't have to think about how do I respond either.
I mean, yeah, I think people will be looking for a leadership team that feels committed and accountable for this, and is not shirking accountability, because you are accountable and this is on you and this is your responsibility to manage. And I think the more that you can do that, the better it's going to land with everyone impacted and everyone who's staying.
Mm-hmm. Another question, we've been doing so much to foster connection and keep people engaged while we're all working remotely. We have Zoom trivia and happy hour dress-up days, etc. After layoffs, should you keep doing these things as scheduled, or pause
Absolutely.
to allow people that grieving period?
100%. Yes, absolutely. And maybe you have the first one, which is how can we help the people that just were let go?
Yeah.
What can we do to ease their burdens or their frustrations? I would absolutely do that. Maybe, as Matthew says, maybe you do it a little more frequently to help people work through this. The less you gather, the more people can stew, and this stuff bubbles up and takes on a form that you can't manage necessarily. So I would absolutely encourage you to continue.
Yeah,
we've done a lot of virtual happy hours, as well, just as a way to connect people where we actually aren't talking about work. It's just really a way to kind of connect them and bring them through this together. And those layoffs are going to come up, and you'll need to address them and talk about them. Just talk about the people who've left. You acknowledge it. It's not, you don't suddenly turn off a switch and that's it.
Yeah. I wouldn't, though, kind of over-index on manufacturing fun during this time period. I do believe you need to continue the things that you were doing and find, ways where people can gather and talk in a safe way. But I would be sensitive around putting a bunch of activities in that may seem, tone deaf.
Mm-hmm.
Great point.
We are 1 minute left. Final comments from the panelists.
I guess my final comment is, please have the lens of humanity, compassion, and people when you're doing this. There's hard decisions to make. And some are, going to, really impact people, but always keep the lens of how is it going to impact people that you've let go of, and how it's going to impact the people who are staying at your company. And that's the way we're going to, continue to drive business outcomes through this.
I would come back to a little bit of what I said at the beginning. Look, I've been on both ends of it, and just put yourself in their shoes. How would you want to be treated? How, and I think if you look at it through that lens, it'll help you do it in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say what they said, completely agree. The other thing is, if you've never been through this and you're scared and you have a leadership team that's never been through it, please be careful that you don't just follow the employment lawyer's script. They're there for a specific reason, to try to protect the company, but you are the leaders who have to live with that decision. And so sometimes it's just legal advice. It's not the legal have-to-do list. And some of what I've been seeing is coming right out of a law firm playbook that's never really done this, but they're looking at the law and just follow what Matthew says and what Beth says, which is, how would you want this done to you? And recognize your brand is on the line.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to thank you all for joining us. If I can be helpful, or my team can be helpful to you, feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. And we'd also love your feedback. So at the end of this, there's a quick survey. Feel free to share your feedback with us, and we are in this together. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.